you, sir. Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for waiting for technology. And now we have, I think, everything set. It's wonderful to see so many of you on this last, third public lecture of the Institute of Critical Social Inquiry. My name is Ann Stoller. I'm director of it, and it's been going for a good 7 years. Some of you know this well and go, because you're part of the Institute this year, and have heard me say these things too much, but some people haven't. So I feel at least more people should know about the Institute and why we have somebody so incredible as McKenzie Wark with us today. McKenzie has asked me not to do a long introduction. He said, you may not. It's really hard, because if I just was to name all the books he's written, it would take up a long introduction. So I'm going to count on the fact that if you're here, you know something about the extraordinary range of books that she has written. And she is so prolific, has done this in so many different venues, has gone, as she said to me the other day, well, I got bored with that, so I'm going to go to this field. Just the capacity to do that is just amazing on her part. So let me begin. So McKenzie Wark is professor of media and cultural studies, and right here at the New School, so we get to claim her as our own, and has been our own for quite a bit of time, yes. So something out for the New School, right? She is not only an academic. I mean, this year, what really stands out is that none of the people who we've invited are only academics, and nor do they really care that much about being academics. Their work is in the world, and it responds to the world, and it's not just of the moment so that it's, passé, but it is very, very contextual and talking about what are the politics, but not directly saying the politics, but all of the work is political. The range of fields that she's explored over the last 30 years is truly astounding. It may seem to some of you who've heard me before that I'm into superlatives all the time, when people are writing letters of recommendation, but I'm really not at all. This year is a year of superlatives. From her first books, because she has a career that already started in Australia before we got to claim her here. A book, Virtual Geography, published in 1994. And she's obviously very famous for the Hacker's Manifesto. But that's not all. That's the one that, kind of stands out in people's minds. But it is a sort of epitome of her cutting through stale and stalled concepts. And she doesn't make a big thing about this is my new concept, but that is the kind of concept work she's constantly doing in all of her work. Each opens, and I think this is another extraordinary part of it, to a field emergent, whether it's the moment in which hacking's becoming something, real to people, or gamer theory. I mean, it's almost before people have started thinking to write about it, except in maybe a small news article, that McKenzie is already thinking it through in much more complicated ways, like the Situationists, right? And the ways in which the Situationists matter today. I mean, who else was writing right at that, except in very, very academic places about the Situationists? We love to consider ourselves, don't worry, this is going to be really short. We love to consider ourselves public intellectuals, particularly at the New School, right? I think few of us really, really are. And I think what's striking about McKenzie is that she has been in very different venues for a really long time. writing in newspapers, responding to editorials, writing editorials herself. She's been writing a bi-weekly column, Day Tripping, for Document Journal, a New York-based magazine, and her new book, Raving, just came out in February. There's really sort of a book every year, sometimes twice a year, twice a year, 2 a year.
2 this year.
This week. Right, okay. Well, you know, that's McKenzie. So with Zoe Beery and Jeffrey Mack, McKenzie's been curating Writing on Raving, a reading and performance series that opens spaces for critical thinking, creative language, and verbal performances, that celebrates, critiques, contextualizes, and vibe checks the rave, the club, the dance floor, and the techno from diverse and unheard perspectives. And I think one of the other interesting and important things that she may decide to talk about is that each of these projects is experimental in some way, right? It's both content and form, epistolary form. It's experimental in some way that she wasn't doing before. So join me in just celebrating her, welcoming her.
I think, in other words, I'm just a writer, you know, it's like kind of what you do. All right, so this is our topic. The way the screen's set up, it's not showing me my timer, so let me just get one going on my phone.
You want me to just do it and wave at you?
Hang on. About 40 minutes, I should start to wrap up. Yeah, okay. So that's gonna go off. And I'm gonna try and cover a lot of ground. So we're gonna like race through this, and then you can sort of, if there's things people want to pick up, we can pick them up later. So transsexual exception. What if we thought sort of significant categories of critical social thought from the point of view of the transsexual exception? So if you think about class or colonialism or techniques or whatever, what's that from the standpoint of the transsexual exception? So that's the question that I want to ask, and I only have very, very provisional answers to what you get when you start to do that. A note on language. Also, this was not the computer I was going to show these on, so some of the slides are going to look a little wonky. I'll come back to sex and gender, and I'm going to use trans in a way that's going to have a question mark on the end of it, so we can keep open exactly what that's going to designate. And there's a particular reason I want to use transsexual rather than transgender. Firstly, it's just a better word, and I think there's a bit of a turn among some contemporary trans thinkers and writers to sort of take ownership of that word again and change what it means, given that transgender ended up being a term that was supposed to have an inclusive reach in terms of solidarity across gender non-conforming people, but it's then also become restricted to the kind of polite way you can talk about the liberal rights-bearing subject, or transgender is an appropriate thing that Starbucks can say in its, bump that it will put out in Pride Month. So maybe you want transsexual back, because also it's just a fun word to say. And I'm going to be talking specifically about trans femme experiences. This is not to say that non-binary or trans-masc experiences are any the lesser or any less important or anything like that. It's just what I know, like that's my immediate people. And maybe there's something to be said for thinking these things a little bit separately so that we can then also be in solidarity, but where we're aware of our differences in the process of doing that, yeah? So can we tease out and articulate differences, but not have those become antagonistic is 9/10 of politics half the time, yeah? So that's sort of the project. And just a little note on, in the Anglophone world in particular, sex and gender are terms that have different valences. And there's a weird history to that. And it's a history that might be longer than this, but this sexologist John Money gets the credit for the distinction between sex and gender. But here's the kicker. In John Money's world, sex was variable and all over the place, like biological material, the sex of the body stuff. It wasn't giving a neat binary. So what John Money thought is, well, actually, gender is a fixed set of categories in the world that are socially determined for all time, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the project of sexology is to physically alter the variable biological body to fit a social order, yeah? So the biological part's the variable bit, and the social part is the bit that's fixed. That was how it was in sexology in the 1950s. John Money was treating intersex children without their consent, so there's a lot you could say about what's not great about sexology as an institution. The thing I want to point out is that those terms switched value between the 50s and the 70s, and now we use those terms the other way around. Anne Oakley, in a book that used to be very widely read called Sex, Gender and Society, is probably the person who popularized this other version, which is to say, oh, well, sex is fixed, and that's a biological given, but gender is the variable because it's a social construct. So therefore, the project of feminism, well, it won't touch whatever biological sex is, but it can change social institutions. And that's a kind of intellectual move that had tactical value that's come back to bite some of us on the ass. Because the argument for transphobes now is, no, biology is just biology, there's only two sexes, and if you only ever did high school biology, that might seem like the case, but it's kind of not. And so, oh, well, all of this trans stuff, it's just some fad, some fashion where they're trying to just, change the social construct or whatever. So it's like, oh, okay. So gender and transgender is actually kind of not all that helpful, particularly for those of us who did actually change our sex, who did actually modify the matter of the body. So sex gender is already a kind of complicated conceptual history. And thinking one's way through that is maybe the first thing to try to figure out if we're seeing things from the point of view of the transsexual exception. You may be familiar with, and here I'm going to really just do this in a minute, so I can't do it justice. But what Butler does is essentially argue that the naturalizing of sex is a back formation from the production of gender. So what you take to be the naturalized body is itself an artifact of the process of iteratively performing and circling around a gender norm that you can never quite hit. And more specifically, the quote-unquote natural sex of the straight body is a back formation from the kind of melancholic loss of the same-sex parent as an object of attraction. Like that's one of the classic bits of Butler. But this is an interesting way of centering homosexuality in the construction of normative models of gender and then by default of the sex that's then the naturalized version of that. But what happens to transness in that story? It gets displaced. It's actually not the center of that intellectual project. And there's a sort of almost a side note in Butler to do with the way transgender as forms of play reveals the artifice of sex. So it has an aesthetic function, but it's not an object in itself in that body of work. So the transsexual experience is really not quite in that work, and it's a friend, but it's not family, is how I think about much of the work in queer theory. So I could spend an hour talking about how much I hate the phrase socially constructed and want to erase it and never talk about it again. Saying something is socially constructed to me is equivalent to saying it's from God, because where is this social? Is the social in the room with us now? Well, yes, but can you locate it? What's the specific apparatus, right? There's a way in which it became a language that becomes a kind of shorthand for not looking at a set of processes. And in particular, I'm from media studies, right? So I'm going to say from a series of techniques that make things possible. So maybe it's more interesting to start as an orientation by saying, all right, maybe it's not so much that gender is socially constructed, but that sex is a technical artifact, and it is for everyone. It's just a little more obvious if you're transsexual that sex is a technical artifact, but it is for everybody else. The endogenous hormones that I take are an off-label use of one of the most widely used classes of pharmaceuticals on the planet. Yeah, like more people on the planet are on endogenous hormones than anything else, exogenous hormones, I should say. So, in a sense, there's a kind of a widespread sense that the sex of bodies is a technical artifact, and one could start to then expand on the ways that that technique makes us. So I'm dancing around how transsexual and transgender might end up being slightly different terms. And it's very important to make this distinction without it being an opposition. But I want to refer to transsexual as those who modify their sex through surgery, endocrinology, legal reassignment, social comportment in everyday life, and who transition away from an assigned at birth sex to destinations unknown. So transsexual could include people who transition to things other than the opposite side of a binary, yeah? But it's a sense of transition that has one of those techniques involved in it in the transition. Transgender I'm going to use as a broader category of gender non-conforming people, which includes transsexuals, but it's wider than that, and includes people who may not be engaging in any of those modifying practices. And the thing that we need to circle back around to at the end of the day is the solidarity among all of those people who get grouped together as trans, but with an awareness that there's differences at stake in that at the same time. So I'm going to use then trans as a placeholder concept that's going to have an even wider sense than that. And I'm going to start by saying we can initially, and that's the key word here, use transculturally and transhistorically. So the first thing you're saying is, oh, actually, we're everywhere. And it's sometimes tactically useful to say there's always been trans people. Like, we're in every society. We've always existed. To sort of counter this argument that we like magically appeared like mushrooms in about 2013, yeah? It's like there's always been people like us. But the like is the slippery part, right? Because then you start looking transculturally, transhistorically, and it's very important to then be saying, actually it's different everywhere. Like everywhere you go, you're finding different gender systems. Are they even gender systems is the next question that you ask after that. So then you start to see these things as kind of separate. But I think the sort of galaxy brain, like, next step is to then circle back to, oh, okay, so having thought this through transhistorically and cross-culturally, my placeholder concept has to be modified. So whatever trans is perpetually being opened up by examples that show how whatever your starting assumption of it was is not going to hold, and that you need to modify that and even dispense with the word altogether. Because you do get into that classic colonial relation of the production of knowledge, where the centre gets to say what the concept is and everybody else does field work, yeah? Why should other people's concepts about what gender is or what's in its place be equally relevant, yeah? But there's steps to get to that dialogue, yeah? And methodologically, I'm going to use trans with a question mark as the sort of starting proposition there. And so what defines transness anyway? And the way to start with that is it's defined negatively. It's the thing you get separated and isolated out as by what I'm going to call the cis gaze. Anybody know who this is? The rest of you are lucky. So what is that gaze that, sort of turns you into the object where, trans or something like it is the thing that you're going to be called? And I've written elsewhere about cis gaze. I think Laura Mulvey's version of male gaze is a useful starting point for starting to develop that concept. But when people talk about like the male gaze in general conversation, it's assumed to be a gaze that has power, and it does. But the crucial thing in Mulvey is that what drives it is anxiety. The male gaze is anxiety, and specifically castration anxiety, yeah? So the male gaze is a structural point of view that's looking from the point of view of the capacity of the other to take away its power. Yeah? And the thing about that is that that's what makes it dangerous. That's what drives its need to investigate, that's what drives its need to classify, and so on. Isn't it weird that this version of psychoanalysis that centered castration is actually kind of trans? And the inverse and non-symmetrical concept was penis envy. And it's like, oh wait, like that late version of Freud is all trans, but also kind of not. Like it doesn't actually quite grasp what it got there. And maybe there's other affects that circulate around presence or absence of phallus that weren't really thinkable in this framework at all, yeah? And like psychoanalysis does this weird thing to try to account for why trans women still are structured by castration anxiety when it was like, bring it on. Like I couldn't wait to lose some of that nonsense off my body, you know. So maybe like a wider range of affect around sex of the body might be a more interesting place to start. And to start to think particularly about gender panic and how the cis gaze is structured by a gender panic that then requires investigation, categorization, and sometimes the elimination of the object that's causing that panic in the first place. So that's the relationship between cis gaze and trans violence. Yeah, like how is violence the product of that gaze? And how does transsexuality appear as the exception within that gaze, but which has actually got two modalities, and one is threat and the other is joke. To be trans, particularly trans femme, is either, oh, you're dangerous, so therefore we have to, and these days it's along the lines of you're a groomer, you're a pedophile, you're a pervert. The other version of it is joke, and there's a lot of popular cinema along those lines. Mrs. Doubtfire and all that, like Man in a Dress is funny when it's obvious and clockable. All right, so more could be said about cis gaze. I've written about that elsewhere. The thing about it is that it's structural. It's not a thing that individuals have. And trans people see through the cis gaze as well. And it's why we keep like running each other down. It's why we're each other's worst enemy sometimes, yeah? But we might also be involved in a project of trying to find tactics for negotiating within the space of the cis gaze. By attempting to pass, to go stealth so that you're undetectable to it, to do the opposite, to be just so fabulously and obviously trans that you seem like bulletproof, which will work, but it's exhausting. Or to sort of return that gaze, and that's why I love this Juliana Huxtable book. I have a poster of this on my wall, and it like just stares at me like, like, are you doing the work today? And it's that, pardon my language, but it's the fuck off stare, yeah? Like, and this has saved me on the street, yeah? If you can meet that gaze and not look away and make the other deflect, you might get out of that situation, yeah? Like there's a way that it's a kind of an art to be able to return that gaze. All right, so if we're going to start developing an affirmative theory in the space that the cis gaze nominates as its object, then like I don't just want to be negatively defined by the cis gaze. Like a lot of trans people are. They're just like, like going off about how awful Kathleen Stock is. And it's like, I'm sorry, girl, but hating transphobes is not a personality. Like there's a point where that stops helping us. So how do we start to work from the standpoint of the transsexual exception? This one weird little paragraph early in de Beauvoir's Second Sex has always intrigued me because it's dancing around the question of standpoint, where de Beauvoir is like, well, very well, how do we pose the question? How do we propose it at all? Man is at once judge and party to the case, but so is woman. And then I love this rhetorical riff of kind of like, I'm not even going to do some serious thinking here, yeah? What we need is an angel, neither man nor woman, but where shall we find one? Still, the angel would be poorly qualified to speak, for an angel is ignorant of the most basic facts involved in the problem. And this is the part that kills me. With a hermaphrodite, we should be no better off. For here the situation is most peculiar. The hermaphrodite is not really the combination of a whole man and a whole woman, but consists of parts of each and thus is neither. And it's like, girl, did you talk to any intersex people in coming up with this one? Like there's a whole, like a space opens there for other standpoints. Like one of which would be, what's the intersex exception? I'm not going to do that because that's not a space that I can speak from. But in place of hermaphrodite, what if we think, what's the transsexual relation to the question of the second sex? Like that, I think, was where we would start to do some interesting work. All right, so I'm going to race through some ways that we might take the standpoint of the transsexual exception and apply it to certain categories. And I'm going to do this so quickly that you will have so many, you'll not notice the gaps in what I haven't thought through yet, but maybe some questions will tease that out. So, who even is trans with a question mark? Are the Hijra in India, the Gali, who, if I have time, I'll come back to, who existed in the times, the Hellenistic times, time of the Roman Empire and Republic, the Bakla in the Philippines trans, and that's why I've given it this question mark, which is to firstly say yes, secondly say no, and thirdly say to consider the question changes our understanding of what trans is. And we then start to appreciate that what we took to be a standard Western two-gender model is kind of not, is kind of more complicated and it's not going to hold. But why does it seem to hold in the first place? Like, where did the apparent universality of a two-sex model that's rooted in the biological body come from? So, we're going to open up trans as a question, but to sort of move it away from questions of identity. And so, is trans with a question mark studies a thing that we could possibly be doing? Could we provincialize even the category of gender itself? Does every culture actually have a gender system? Is that the appropriate name for it? Just random example, Jailaran Mattery's ethnographic and historical work on Yoruba possession religions, where there's overlapping and not quite mappable languages in the place of gender, and one is the mounted and mounter. So the assigned male at birth person who's to be possessed by the god is mounted by the god and therefore feminized, will appear in feminine dress and so forth after an initiation rite. But is also referred to as the bride of the god. So is it bride or is it mount? And there's a whole series of overlapping languages. And where Mattery's going to go with this is actually, is it even still a gender system that we're thinking about there? To what extent is the idea of there being two biologically determinate sexes an artifact of the colonial gaze itself? And then just to give a drive-by example of that is Jessica Hinchy's work on the Hijra and what became of them in the northern part of India during the British colonial administration, which was that part of the Criminal Tribes Act tried to outlaw the Hijra and it kind of make them go away because they don't fit in the colonial model. Not just ideologically of what the two sexes are, but of what their social roles are, what kind of labour they're supposed to be performing. And also the Hijra are organised. They're not random individuals. It's an organised kind of culture that's trans question mark in that wider sense. And their capacity to be organised in networks that moved beyond colonial territorial boundaries was one of the things that suggested to the British that they were a criminal society, and hence they're folded into the Criminal Tribes Act. They don't go away, like the Hijra still exist, but the idea of attempting to eradicate genders that don't look like the two that colonisers had in mind is such a widespread practice that you start to wonder if universalism is really just an artefact of processes of colonisation. Next slide is a little gruesome. So content warning to talk about what Deborah Miranda calls gendercide. Can we think that as a concept specific to that practice of eliminating or attempting to eliminate categories of people based on a perception of their gender anomaly? Miranda's example is the extermination of the Hoya, which was a third gender in question marks, in inverted commas, around what's now San Diego. We don't know what they called themselves. Hoya is Spanish for jewel, probably meant ironically or disparagingly. Like the British in India, the Spanish colonizers can only perceive them as sodomites. They're seeing what they think are men dressed as women having sex with men, and it's like, oh, well, they're men they're sodomites, right? Which is neither socially nor religiously acceptable. So they need to be murdered, which is sort of pretty much what happened. With the extermination of the Hoya, also what disappeared is the ritual function. And the one thing we do know from Spanish records is that Hoya had significant roles in the passage from life to death. And so once you've taken out that whole category of people, what option do you have but to then be folded into the Catholic version of that? And the church takes the place of the Hoya in one particularly significant ritual. Now, maybe that colonial and cis gaze comes home to roost. A significant moment of that is the burning of the Hirschfeld Institute Library in 1933 by the Nazis, one of the early classes of victim of the Nazis, so what you now think of as trans and queer people. And that ended a sort of pioneering gender clinic, which actually, among other things, was doing important work in birth control and sex education for straight people, but also what disappeared with the closure of Hirschfeld Institute and the burning of its libraries, we lost the research. So we have Hirschfeld's book. Hirschfeld is the person who was able to separate the categories of transsexuality and homosexuality, because guess what? Not all trans people are gay. Some are straight. Some trans women date men, some don't. Like, they're different, separate categories and have to be thought as, things that have separate realities in the world. And we have those papers, but we don't have the field work, we don't have the documentation that that result is based on. So one of the answers to the question of why did trans people seem to have just occurred is because we keep getting erased. Like, there's a kind of erasure of our existence that happens over and over again. So, you kind of have to dig us back out of the archive, but through the colonial cis gaze, which is only going to perceive us in a certain way. And important to say in the American context that sex and gender is and was always a set of racialized categories. The story of J. Marion Sims, the quote-unquote father of gynecology, is relatively well known. One of the two statues of him in New York got taken down. There's another one that's still up if anybody wants a project. And the version of this I like because in terms of where the book goes is C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, which is going to start with how the bodies of enslaved African women are the basis for the production of a knowledge of gynecology, which was meant, firstly, after it was perfected, for the bodies of white women. It's also going to be used on the bodies of slaves to return them to productive use. And if you really have to give everyone a content warning for this chapter of Black on Both Sides, because Sims performed 30 failed operations on the same woman before figuring out how to repair a fistula. And great that one can repair a fistula, but her name was Anaka. There are several other women. Lucy is another one. Sims gets confused in his own notes as to the names of the slaves at some point. It's a truly horrifying story, but sex and gender has always been racialized, and experiments on racialized bodies, which are not being treated as the bodies of humans, makes possible a knowledge of the biology of the human body in relation to sex. That's then to be applied to those who at this time still counted as human. So it's very hard to find the traces of what I'm going to call vernacular trans persistence. So we show up as different characters in different stories, and we often only show up when we're in breach of the law. So, for example, we know about and I'm going to call her Mary Jones, which was what she called herself, because she got arrested, and she gives testimony in court in 1836. And, you know, one has to treat testimony people give in court with a certain caution, and Kendall would know more about this than I would, but this is not exactly, you know, neutrally volunteered life story, yeah? So Mary Jones is sort of saying, you know, I was waiting upon girls in the brothel, and they thought I looked good in a dress, and so it's sort of like somebody else makes her do it. But ends up by saying, yeah, and they said I look good, so I kept wearing the dress, you know. I've always attended parties among the people of my own colour dressed in this way, and in New Orleans I always dressed in this way. So this always existed somewhere. Like there was always some vernacular transness in the community that this person came from, but of which we don't have a lot of record. Like they exist, like you can find it, you can tease it out, but there is still work to be done to find where we were and who we were, which will modify whatever we thought trans was in the first place, yeah? And again, I'm going to call this person Jenny June, which was their preferred name, en femme. The book is published as by Ralph Werther. It originally came out in 1918. You can get this lovely, cheap edition with a really great introduction. But the introduction conflates transness and homosexuality. Like there's a way in which there's a missed opportunity in the way this book got reissued. But Jenny June was a student at Columbia who was sneaking out of the dorms, putting a dress on and going downtown. And there's like really great accounts of nightlife and street life in parts of New York and in the early part of the 20th century. And it's not all a happy story, right? In saying that there's always been vernacular transness, there's still violence. And Jenny June gets gang raped in 20 pages into this memoir, yeah? But we also get this story about a house party where Jenny June bought the liquor, so again, you know, how people are treating her is shaped by that. But she writes, the girls thought nothing strange of me, as the nature of fairies was well known to them, yeah? So she's hanging out with people in contemporary parlance, might be sex workers, they're having a party. Jenny just wants to get railed, that's why she's buying everybody liquor and turning it into a party. But none of this is new. There's a vernacular transness underneath the versions of it that are getting caught by the legal apparatus or are being treated as interesting subjects of experiment by psychiatric and medical apparatus and so on. So we've had different names, and not just names, but with slightly different people. We've been fairies, we've been mollies, drag queens, femme queens in the system of the drag ball language. And this picture is of Star, street transvestite, action revolutionaries. Why did these street queens in late 60s, early 70s, and this is Sylvia Rivera is in the picture, why'd they not call themselves transgender? Well, the term hadn't entered common parlance yet. But they're also not going to call themselves transsexual because they don't have access to the medicalised framework that entailed at the time. So in forming this short-lived but important organisation, they call themselves transvestites. So how does the point of view of the transsexual exception frame how we think about sex and sexuality? And here I'm drawing on the work of Emma Heaney in this book, The New Woman. And it's interesting. Her examples are mostly literary. I pulled out two that I can, have a visual reference. But transfemininity is this recurring theme in modernism as a figure that is emblematic of the modern itself. So to what extent did transness become allegorical? And it's either the avatar of the possibility of the remaking of the world that the modern makes possible, or it's why the modern is terrible because it's destroying any recognisable landmarks or anchors by which we could navigate. So I think you can think Marcel Duchamp's famous cross-dressing as Rose Célevé, or lesser well-known but interesting moment when Cocteau and Man Ray get kind of obsessed with this cross-dressing act whose name was Barbette, and they produce a book together about her. And there's like a history still to be done, I think, about the role of female impersonation as a popular form of entertainment and how that's feeding into certain ideas about what modernity is. There's trans allegories at the heart of these two texts that I had to study really closely as someone who's like of that theory era where like Barthes and Foucault were people you had to really get down. Herculine, and Foucault edits this text and writes a commentary on it. In today's language, Herculine might be intersex, but of course the point of it, the point of the book is to trace the regimes of observation and classification through which this person had to live. And Herculine is somebody who was raised as a girl, goes to convent school, is like making out with the other girls, like having a good time, but then starts to develop secondary sex characteristics that seem masculine. And firstly falls under the authority of the church to assign what that person's body is classified as, and they get a pass and they get to go back to the convent. Then secondly, as a man, and they're obliged to live their later life as a man, and that goes very badly, and the story kind of peters out. But yeah, what if we restored the, trans with a question mark quality to that story? Does it reframe the object that we're looking at? I learned how to do structuralism from Roland Barthes, and I forget how many, is there like 7 types of reading that you're supposed to learn from Essed? And it's based on a short story that's all about a castrati. So once again, the object at the heart of the text has that quality of transness built into it. So to what extent is the way one came to think about disciplinary or semiotic regimes actually understood through transness, rather than, for example, homosexuality? Like you kind of rewrite that history. And how did the modernist version of transfemininity as allegorical end up in queer theory? And this is Heaney's argument, that without really knowing that it did it, queer theory is repeating the modernist fascination with transfemininity as allegory of modernity, but in this case specifically as allegory of the possibility of the critical unmaking and remaking of seemingly naturalized gender. Where you find that is in attempts to read this film Paris is Burning, which is a really complicated, compromised text in a lot of ways, but which documents the lives of queer and trans people in the ballroom scene in the early 90s. Venus Extravaganza dies in the middle of the movie, and nevertheless is being criticised for the way she did gender. And I'm like, did you miss the part about how she gets murdered? I don't know. I always found it really hard also to watch the film, but also to read the texts about it, in the sense that, oh, you saw Paris is Burning and thought it's a way of thinking conceptually about what gender is and its undoing, whereas what I'm seeing is a story about violence, homelessness, compulsory sex work. How did we miss what this story could actually then be about? So I think there's sort of work to do to like reread that text and recontextualize it from the point of view of the trans exception. And there's a actually really lovely text Jose Munoz wrote about Kevin Aviance, but it's where like Jose is interested in the role that the drag queen plays in a gay club, but I just think it's one that lends itself to a different reading. To what extent is the drag queen there to perform an act of disavowal? And it's so on the surface, but not quite articulated in that text, how much that's about. Because Jose frames it by writing about compulsory performances of, like super butch masculinity that's being forced on him in a Cuban household. So I think there's ways the transness of queer theory is like begging for a kind of symptomatic reading to kind of tease it out. More I could say about that. But, you know, the kind of parallel discourse that's happening to that was engaging with it that it doesn't engage with is people like Susan Stryker, whose early 90s texts are para-academic. They're things that are being written in BDSM journals and things like that, showing up in performance art spaces, and attempting to engage with that body of work. But with that body of work's not really engaging with her, even though this is the second most cited article in the whole of GLQ, Gay Liberation Quarterly. And for anybody who knows this text, his famous concept is trans rage, yeah? Like it's also a classic of affect theory, but its affect is rage. And the proximate trigger of that rage in the text is Susan being present at the birth of a child in her family by choice. And the child is immediately gendered by the doctor in the room, and everybody just accepts it. Yeah, and it's like, you know what? There's a 1% chance that's wrong. Why are we not leaving that door open? There's been attempts to build trans theory-like components of queer theory out of psychoanalysis, but the most polemical thing I want to say is psychoanalysis is not our friend and never has been and owes us reparations for 100 years of abuse. Yeah? I keep saying this to psychoanalysts and they change the topic. It's not discussable. But starting with Freud, we've been misdiagnosed, misunderstood, institutionalized and abused by what claims to be a body of knowledge that will not account for the violence and harm that it's done. Yeah? So simple as that. Absolutely most egregious example, and she's not responsible for the cover, which is a horror in itself, is Catherine Millo's Horse Sex, which is the second most transphobic book I've ever read in my frickin' life, and is not a marginal text in the history of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Yeah, so maybe it's not our friend. If one needs a hook in a conceptual apparatus, I find, of all things, Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology a hell of a lot more useful because it starts with the ambiguity of the body. Yeah, it doesn't start with sex as structure. It starts with the ambiguity of the body and the emergence of the body out of. I'm going to have to speed up. Out of desire is a term you could question here. It's Gail Salamon's term. Out of its encounter with that of an other. So maybe what's useful about that is the way one's perception of one's own transness is neither something that an authorized cis gaze can categorize you as an object according to, but neither is it something that you can subjectively self-report on your own. It's a thing you've kind of learned out of a set of practices, and you need to sort of unearth what those practices were. And there might be better ways to practice the coming into transsexuality than others. Hence, for example, T for T, trans for trans culture. All right, so where I was going with this is, rather than psychoanalysis, what if we thought trans femininity through sort of sex worker literature and theory, which is kind of emerging as a field? One could also do disability studies, but you know, what is the sort of production of low theory and vernacular knowledge by sex workers there to tell us about experiences of trans femininity, because even though those are not the same thing, they overlap so much in terms of the kind of life experience of a good many trans women. Not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about class, but one would have to start with what Kay Gabriel calls the abjection of trans femme bodies and exclusion from formal labour force more often than not, the peculiar role that super-exploited, abjected labour performs in hierarchies of labour and how it's valued, the curious place that sex work has in relation to the social reproduction of labour power as the kind of necessary exception to it, and the role of trans femininity in that to, pardon my language, to be that class of object that's fuckable but not breedable. Yeah, you don't have to worry about the illegitimate kids with us. I'm not now going to have time to get into Paul Preciado, but I think this work is so productive and useful, even if it's wrong, in rethinking what if we rethought the whole of sort of post-war, overdeveloped world political economy through the kind of pills and porn techniques that shaped the possibilities of modern and contemporary bodies. And a thought alongside labour power that should say potentia gaudendi, which I'm then going to also transliterate as like come power as one of the driving engines, the collective collaborative capacity of bodies to experience ecstasy is a thing that commodification latched itself onto. Work still to be done on the changing labour niches of transness as usually as objected labour, but occasionally not. When is our labour not abject is a kind of interesting question. We show up most often as sex workers, in nightlife, fashion and beauty, in modelling. There's a weird little anomaly of a clustering of trans women who work in tech and are often really well paid for it, and I've yet to see a good sociological explanation of why that happened. If anybody wants a thesis project, that one's just gone begging. Like, why is there a cluster of trans women in tech? Like, how did that happen? I don't know. There's bad explanations. I'm waiting for a good one. Not going to go through all of this, but did the attempt at our inclusion as liberal rights-bearing subjects correspond to the commodification of difference in an information economy? Is there a political economic rationale for why it seemed we should be tolerated in workplaces other than sex work and nightlife? Because we bring difference, and that difference is exploitable, whether it's for a TV show or in fashion or whatever. So that would be my sort of less than, well, actually outright pessimistic version of why it seemed like transliberation was going to have its moment, but actually didn't. Not going to have time to get into techniques and nature. I really would love to tell you more about this story of how Mexico became a major supplier of exogenous hormones because of a yam that was discovered in Oaxaca. And Mexico still has a pharmaceutical industry that's subsidiary to the global one, precisely because of this one plant and the fact that you could extract exogenous hormones from it, which now a huge, billions on the planet are now on. And one little weird, sort of off-label use for which is trans medicine. And let me just end with this one to think about techniques. Many of you might be familiar with Donna Haraway's famous "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess," which I think is mostly aimed at Starhawk and that kind of eco-naturalistic version of feminism that's maybe best summarised in this book, The Fifth Sacred Thing. But what I want to ask is, do I have to choose? Can I be both? Can I be a cyborg and a goddess? And when have we been goddesses? Well, the galley in the ancient world is a poem by Catullus about the galley. Not going to have time to get into the role we play in Lucretius. The trans women are like the bad object of how nature's not supposed to reproduce itself. I don't have time to go into Schreiber. Schreiber's not about repressed homosexual desire. Schreiber is like lying in bed imagining it would be really great to be fucked like a woman. It doesn't require any other explanation. It's a moment of gender euphoria. And this paragon of the Prussian state has a psychotic break precisely because of that realization of how incompatible that desire and that feeling is with the office that he is supposed to hold. And of course he gets institutionalized and probably abused as a result of that. So I'm going to say she's one of our saints. Anybody read Artaud's Heliogabalus? And again, this language is anachronistic and wrong in the first pass. But there was a transsexual woman who was emperor of Rome for 4 years before they murdered her and threw her in the Cloaca Maxima. So what does it mean to think the transness of Heliogabalus, but through Artaud's like delirious account of it? And what's great about Artaud for me is the way that theological problems are directly and immediately about the social, the affective, and power all at the same time. So I kind of recommend that book as like extremely curious version of that. Was Artaud trans? It's never an interesting question to ask, but can we suspend the assumption that writers are cis to open up the possibility that they might be something other than what even they thought they were? And my slim piece of evidence is Anais Nin reporting that while Artaud was writing this particular book, he said, "I am Heliogabalus, the mad Roman emperor." All right, so I'm going to end it there. Are there ways that we could think the transsexual exception as a point of view that gives us ways to reframe colonialism and race, gender and sexuality, class and economy, nature and techniques, ancient and modern, secular and religious? Is there a way of situating the modern medicalized Western transsexual as firstly our model for what we might observe elsewhere, secondly as incompatible with those, but thirdly as things we can group back together to think about how we might move then from difference to solidarity among different versions of transfemininity, then different versions of gender expansiveness in general. So I'll leave it there.
Hi, I hesitate in a way because I'm afraid maybe I have the cis gaze or something, and I feel like now I'm part of a whole class. But I don't know, my favorite thing you said came toward the very, very end about people, who would like to be fucked like a woman is fucked. And I thought, wow, I can relate to that. I can really relate to that. And then I just want to mention, there's a famous woman poet who I cannot think of her name to save my life, but years ago, and I think she may be at the NYU or used to be, but as a guest poet. But years ago, she had a poem about people lining up in a big stadium, I guess they were women or trans women, waiting to have fuck their brains out, have that happen to them. And it was a very enticing poem, although I'm sort of tired of it now. I mean, it was very enticing at the time, but whatever. But I can't think of her name, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
I have a whole other riff on whole theory, but we're not doing that one tonight. Yeah.
Kendall.
McKenzie, I'm wondering if you might be willing to say a little bit about situations or analytical frames in which we can think the question of trans and queer, or specifically gay, together. And I say specifically gay because your critique of the standard interpretation of Memoirs of My Illness made me think of the famous essay, Is the Rectum a Grave, right? Where the thesis is that what most terrifies the cis heterosexual male imagination is the thought of a grown man on his back with his legs up in the air like a woman.
Yeah.
But then the essay goes on to interrogate the compensatory overinvestment in a kind of caricature that is the Tom of Finland gay macho male, right? So it is in fact the case, right, as an historical sociological matter that for at least one and possibly several generations of men, the way to imagine themselves as gay was on some level, in your terms, to imagine themselves as trans, right? So I'm interested in the ways in which trans is the bridge, right, for imagining a set of sexual possibilities and making sense of a set of sexual desires on whose other side is gay, male masculinity in particular. And if there is some possibility for an articulation of that identity indifference, right, or that differential identity, what are the political possibilities that the rereading of Schreber that you're suggesting through the lens of is the rectum a grave? What are both the analytic and political possibilities of that encounter with the trans exception as something that is constitutive, right, of gay male desire?
There's histories on both sides of the disavowal of the other. So there's a history of the proper medicalized transsexual subject refusing homosexuality, like that happened. It's like, no, I'm not gay, I'm a straight woman, you know. And it still happens, like you still find that in community. But there's also that way in which, particular model of male homosexuality that could disassociate itself from, among other things, officially being classified as a mental illness, came at the price of its separation and disavowal from transness in this expanded sense. And I mean, I lived that personally. Like, I tried to be a gay man 3 times, and the first time was in the early 80s, where if you were femme, you weren't getting in the club. Like, you just couldn't get in. Like, it's like, no, like, we're not doing that anymore. Because this is the version of male homosexuality that's not whatever that weird shit you are doing is now, you know. So, yeah, I think there's a project to be done to trace out the that repeated note of a relation to femininity in gay male culture as one that's had different valences and levels of acceptance at different times. Like in John Rashi's City of Night, it's just this continuity of cultures where, you know, there's hustlers and there's drag queens in the language of the time. They're occupying the same space. And they're different kinds of characters, but there's continuity between them. And when do those start to sort of separate out? And it always was, if you think, like all of trans culture, because it doesn't neatly map onto a sexual preference. Like, trans people can have any sexual preference, so there's always part of it was kind of elsewhere. But yeah, I think there's still sort of work to be done. And the like a woman is, because I think that's even the phrase in Is the Rectum a Grave, yeah? By Bassani, I'm blanking on the name for a sec. But why like honey? Maybe you were, like maybe you were in that minute, and what would it mean to accept that and process that? And then, yeah, like I feel the pressure and the weight of having to perform a masculinity that lets you be a subject in the world, like lets you be someone who has pride and can walk down the street and all that. But at what cost? You know, like what severance happens in that process? So I think there's sort of like a long project to think some of that through and weave some of that back together a little bit. And from the trans side, there's going to be some rage, some bad feelings about this, but we kind of got to get that out and process that, I think, to get back to what obviously is the main agenda of our moment, which is solidarity, because they're out for all of us, right? Like, we know that. They're coming for all of us. And by all of us, I mean all of us. Like, they're coming for no-fault divorce, you know? They're not just coming for the trannies and the gay. They're coming for everybody, you know? They're coming for birth control. So, yeah, can we have the moment of venting, you know, historically accumulated injury and misunderstanding quickly to come back to that moment, you know? I read every single text in the gay canon now, and I'm going, this is trans, that bit's trans, that bit, and it's like, it's sort of like also wrong methodologically. It's not, you know, but it's there to be. I was reading Esther Newton last night, and I'm going, oh, honey, why didn't you just come out? You know, like like, Esther Newton is talking about gender dysphoria, you know, but it's like, I get it, I respect your right to stay a butch lesbian, but it's so close to the line, you know? It's so near.
Please excuse me, those who are in McKenzie's seminar. I'm really going to try first. You're not? Oh, great. Okay, but did I see somebody here who wanted to speak? Yeah, and then...
Thank you. First off, thank you so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the sort of class political economy section that I know we had to rush through a little bit.
Yeah.
But I thought something that I thought was interesting in the colonialism section, and this is following off of like the research of Feinberg as well, is that so much of the repression of trans ? Cultures was part of an attempt to sort of modernize the economy, right, and modernize production. And I think it's interesting that in the sort of current moment we're seeing these anti-trans attacks sort of not take that form, right? It does not seem like it is based in trying to modernize the economy. And what you were saying about the sort of vectoral economy and the role of objectification of trans labor. So I was wondering if you could just sort of expand on that and see how you see these attacks in that sort of context.
Yeah, you know, I've got an argument in a different context that sort of stresses the transformation difference of the contemporary economy from classical industrial capitalism. And I don't want too much to rest on that because I'm kind of on my own with that a little bit. But it seems to me that whatever even just like modern Western transness is, like, changes significantly over the course of a century, and that part of that is political economic. And I was just thinking, randomly, there's a piece about Christine Jorgensen in the Washington Post yesterday, who was, you know, this famous trans woman celebrity of the 50s. Like, she's not the first trans woman, but it's the first one who's a global celebrity. You know, like, is well known as the atom bomb in 1953 or whatever. But so much of it is about her as a manufactured article, that modern science and techniques could make this body. And then in every other respect, it's, you know, you're supposed to be charmed initially by the production of standard femininity. But the language of the transsexual is a manufacturing language, but the language of transgender seems to me to be a language about the information economy. And that's where we get caught a little bit politically, as if we hadn't also still manufactured ourselves as you know, sort of bodies as well. So yeah, and Christine Jorgensen is reported on favourably for a minute, and then the transphobia kind of sinks in, and much more complicated story around black trans ? People who are surfacing in that era, and that's in Snorton's book, and that's a sort of more subtle, interesting story. But yeah, it ended up sort of like not working as a public act of the manufacture of, you know, seemingly normative femininity, and got pushed back into the category of, you know, sort of deviance and the thing to be sort of policed, or the thing to be done only in stealth mode. And that seems to be different to where we are now, where that sort of massive bifurcation of class life chances now, like, affects it a lot, that you have like a mass of trans people who are basically to be denied any life chances at all, and a handful who are sort of able to find niches in a kind of like viable you know, production of self through having some particular skill or celebrity, you know, like those are your options, and there's nothing in the middle anymore. It seems to be where we are. But it's sort of still a straw in the wind as to whether, particularly trans femininity in this case, is one of the acceptable forms of rights-bearing liberal subject. And I'm sort of pessimistic about our chances of hanging on to that, but obviously one fights for it. Because, like, I don't think that's enough, but it's certainly better than the alternative, which is back to full criminalisation.
Question there.
McKenzie, thank you for that. I thought it was excellent, and I just have to say that I'm a bit tired, so...
Aren't we all, honey?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm interested in the colonisation aspect, and I recognise that you said, started off with this kind of universal category of trans and then said that you can then undermine it when you actually look at different cultures. And I guess I'm interested in trans as an imperial concept and the way that it operates, because, I'm Samoan and we have whawhawhine, which means in a manner of a woman. And we also have in our kind of religious tradition a being that created us, which is sometimes referred to as neither man or like male or female, or sometimes both. And Samoans were actually created by a bird, which I take to be genderless.
Yeah.
The problem is, and I completely agree with you, I actually think these universal categories and the binary is created through the colonial encounter. But because it's created through the colonial encounter, it's hard for us to now think about what these meanings could mean for us, because I think there's also this other imperial aspect that's coming from the US through the concept of trans, for example, picked up by the UN. So we had a human rights conference in 2015 and we tried to use our own terms, which ended up being like a full paragraph of different terminology. And they were like, no, it's got to be LGBTQI. And then I noticed in 4 years' time, people who were refusing the term trans started referring to trans. And so my concern is the loss of this incredible complexity through this kind of colonial encounter, which is queer.
It already happened in the United States. Like David Valentine was doing field work here in New York, probably late 90s, and is asking people how they refer to themselves, and everybody just says gay, like we're gay, and then finds a couple of people who are, I'm transgender because that's what gets you services at the gay centre, because they were turning on the tap to make resources available if that's who you were. So it kind of already happened here, is that it sort of erased people for whom gay would have been a more capacious category, or in Valentine, some people saying that they're queens or femme queens because they're attached to ballroom. So there's a way in which it's not even uniquely a colonial problem, but a problem. There's travesty here in New York because there's a big Spanish population. So yeah, but how much does it then end up being what tactics are available to you to, at one and the same time, try to insist on the difference, but where there's utility in using a transnational language you didn't have agency over because there's resources attached to it to code switch into that, But that's the entire trans experience, is having to operate in languages that you don't control and that mean things you don't want them to mean. You kind of stuck with that over and over again, and all you ever have is tactics in language. But if you recognise they're just tactics, to not just do that, to sort of try and do that bit as expeditiously as possible to move on to what else you can achieve.
What can I say? Thank you all for your interventions, really interesting, but most of all, thank you, McKenzie, for just provoking
And
us.
thanks to Cam and to Clara and to everybody who's a fellow and to Anne.
Here, here.